the little bookshop that only opened after sunset, a cozy sleep story for busy minds. If today felt like one long list of things to finish, places to be, emails to answer, or thoughts that simply refuse to quiet down, then perhaps this evening can be a little different. Imagine that somewhere, tucked away beyond the streets where traffic slowly fades and office lights blink off one by one, there is a place that never hurries. A place where clocks seem to breathe instead of tick. Where no one asks what you accomplished today. Where simply arriving is enough. Tonight, we'll visit that place together. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders settle. There is nowhere else you need to be for a little while. On the edge of a quiet New England town stood an old train station that many travelers barely noticed anymore. It wasn't grand or famous. There were no flashing signs or crowded platforms. Just weathered wooden benches polished smooth by decades of waiting, hanging lanterns that glowed with a warm amber light, and flower boxes overflowing with lavender whose gentle fragrance drifted through the evening air. Every weekday, just after sunset, one final commuter train rolled into the station. Among the passengers was a man named Oliver. Like many people, Oliver spent his days surrounded by meetings, calendars, reminders, and endless notifications. His work wasn't especially unusual, but it carried the kind of invisible weight that followed him home each evening. Even after closing his laptop, lists continued to arrange themselves inside his mind. Reply tomorrow. Don't forget Friday. What if that presentation isn't ready? Did I lock the office? Should I have called my sister today? The thoughts never argued loudly. They simply lined up one after another, patiently waiting for attention. As the train slowed, Oliver looked out the window. The town looked exactly as it always had. Small brick buildings rested beneath maple trees whose leaves danced gently in the cooling breeze. Porch lights welcomed families home. Bicycles leaned against white fences. Somewhere nearby, someone had just baked fresh bread, and the comforting scent floated through the station. It reminded him of evenings from long ago. Back when dinner happened at the same table every night. Back when phones stayed attached to kitchen walls. Back when people measured time by sunsets instead of deadlines. The train doors opened with a soft sigh. Passengers stepped onto the platform, each moving at their own pace. Some hurried toward waiting cars. Others walked home carrying grocery bags. A young couple laughed quietly over something only they understood. An older gentleman tipped his cap to the station attendant before disappearing down the street. Oliver usually followed the same familiar route home. Tonight, though, something felt different. Not dramatic. Not mysterious. Just lighter somehow. The evening carried a calm that invited slower footsteps. Instead of reaching for his phone, he slipped it into his coat pocket. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, there seemed to be nothing urgent waiting for him. He left the station and wandered toward streets he had never bothered to explore. The sidewalks curved gently beneath tall maple trees whose branches formed natural archways overhead. Warm lights glowed behind curtains. Wind chimes answered the breeze with quiet music. Someone watered roses beside a white cottage. A golden retriever stretched lazily across a porch without opening its eyes as Oliver passed. No one appeared to be rushing. Even the air seemed to move more slowly here. He noticed little things that usually escaped attention. A robin settling into its nest. The rhythmic sound of distant crickets beginning their nightly concert. The soft creak of a wooden swing moving ever so slightly on an empty porch. Somewhere farther away came the comforting whistle of the departing train, growing fainter until it became part of the evening itself. Oliver smiled without realizing it. He couldn't remember the last time he had walked without checking the time. At the next corner stood a tiny bakery with chairs outside. An elderly woman arranged fresh cinnamon rolls behind the window. Instead of looking busy, she appeared completely content to place each pastry exactly where she wanted it. Oliver paused. She noticed him through the glass. Rather than trying to sell him anything, she simply smiled and waved. It was such an ordinary kindness that it caught him by surprise. He waved back, then continued walking. The streets became narrower, the houses older. Stone pathways wound between gardens overflowing with lavender, daisies, rosemary, and climbing ivy. Fireflies blinked softly among the flowers like tiny floating lanterns. The sky deepened into rich shades of blue, while the first stars quietly introduced themselves overhead. Oliver realized something unusual. His thoughts had begun to spread farther apart. Instead of dozens arriving every minute, only one or two drifted through his mind before quietly floating away. He wasn't trying to meditate. He wasn't solving problems. He was simply walking. Sometimes that was enough. Ahead, another narrow street appeared between two centuries-old buildings built from gray stone. He almost walked past it. There was no sign, no map, just a cobblestone lane lined with old gas lamps whose gentle glow painted warm circles across the ground. Something about the little street felt inviting, as though it had been patiently waiting for someone who wasn't in a hurry. Oliver stepped onto the cobblestones. His footsteps became softer. The sounds of the town faded behind him. Even the evening breeze seemed to whisper instead of blow. Halfway down the lane, he noticed a warm golden light shining through a row of old windows farther ahead. It wasn't bright enough to demand attention. It simply waited, like a quiet welcome waiting at the end of a peaceful walk. And without quite knowing why, Oliver found himself smiling once again as he continued toward the gentle glow that seemed perfectly at home beneath the first stars of the evening. The golden light grew a little brighter with every unhurried step. Oliver noticed that the windows belonged to a building that looked older than anything else on the lane. Red bricks had faded into soft shades of brown, ivy climbed carefully around the stone doorway, and a small bronze bell hung above a weathered wooden door. The sign above it was simple: The Evening Bookshop. The letters had been painted by hand many years ago. Some had begun to fade, but they were still easy to read beneath the warm glow of two lanterns. There was something curious about the place. The windows reflected the evening sky, yet inside, everything looked brighter than it should have. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books of every size. Lamps cast pools of golden light across worn wooden tables. A fire crackled quietly somewhere deeper inside. It felt less like a store and more like someone's favorite room. Oliver reached for the brass handle. The little bell above the door gave a soft, pleasant ring as he stepped inside. A gentle warmth wrapped around him immediately. Not the heavy warmth of a crowded room, but the comforting kind that comes from old fireplaces, fresh tea, and walls that have quietly sheltered people for generations. The scent surprised him first. Old paper, cedar wood, a hint of cinnamon, fresh tea leaves, and somewhere beneath it all, lavender. It was a fragrance that somehow reminded him of libraries, rainy afternoons, and childhood weekends all at once. He stood quietly, allowing his eyes to adjust. Books surrounded him everywhere. Some were neatly arranged on polished shelves. Others rested in cheerful little stacks beside comfortable armchairs. A rolling ladder waited against one wall, ready for anyone reaching toward the highest shelves. Small lamps illuminated reading corners instead of bright overhead lights. Nothing buzzed. Nothing beeped. Nothing demanded attention. Only the fireplace spoke, its gentle crackling filling the room with a rhythm older than conversation. Near one of the windows, a large orange cat lay sleeping on a faded blue cushion. One ear twitched as Oliver entered. The cat opened one eye just enough to acknowledge the newcomer. Apparently satisfied that nothing exciting was happening, it closed the eye again and continued sleeping. Oliver smiled. "I suppose that's my welcome committee. You've received a very warm welcome." The voice came from somewhere behind a nearby bookshelf. An elderly gentleman appeared, carrying 3 books balanced comfortably in one arm. His silver hair was neatly combed, and round glasses rested low on his nose. He wore a dark green cardigan with leather patches on the elbows, and somehow looked exactly like someone who had spent a lifetime surrounded by books. His expression held the kind of smile that expected nothing in return. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening. I don't believe we've met before." Oliver shook his head. "I don't think so." "Then I'm very glad you found your way here." The gentleman extended a hand. "My name is Samuel." "Oliver." They shook hands. Samuel's handshake was steady, warm, and completely unhurried. "Please," Samuel said, gesturing toward the room, "have a look around. Nothing here is in a hurry." It was an unusual thing to say, yet somehow it made perfect sense. Oliver wandered between the shelves. Some books looked almost new. Others had cloth covers softened by countless readers. Many had handwritten labels instead of printed ones. One shelf simply read, "Stories for Rainy Evenings." Another said, "Books Best Read Beside a Window." A smaller shelf near the fireplace carried a sign that made Oliver quietly laugh. "For people who forgot to rest." He found himself stopping in front of it. The titles were wonderfully ordinary. "The Long Walk Home," "An Afternoon by the Lake," "Letters from the Garden," "The Baker Who Closed Early." Each title sounded less like an adventure and more like an invitation to slow down. Samuel noticed where Oliver was standing. "That shelf seems popular lately." Oliver chuckled softly. "I guess a lot of people forget to rest." "They do." Samuel placed another book onto a nearby shelf. "They aren't lazy. They aren't careless. They simply carry too much." Oliver nodded before realizing he had done so. The words felt strangely familiar. Samuel continued arranging books. Years ago, people carried baskets, firewood, and groceries. He smiled gently. Now they carry unfinished conversations, tomorrow's meetings, notifications, expectations, and questions that don't have answers yet. Oliver looked around the quiet room. "I suppose books are lighter." Samuel laughed softly. "Much lighter." He disappeared briefly behind another shelf and returned carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I've already made tea. You were expecting someone?" Samuel handed him one of the mugs. "I always am." Oliver accepted it. The mug warmed his hands immediately. Steam curled upward with a gentle scent of chamomile and honey. He took a careful sip. The tea wasn't extraordinary. It was simply made with patience. Somehow, that made all the difference. Outside, evening settled completely over the little town. The lanterns beyond the windows glowed like distant stars. Inside, the fire continued its quiet conversation with the old wooden room. The orange cat stretched, yawned with impressive determination, then wandered over to Oliver as though finally deciding he might be worth meeting. Without asking permission, the cat circled once before settling comfortably beside his chair. Samuel smiled. "Well, what?" "He usually waits much longer." "For what?" "To decide someone looks like they could use a peaceful evening." Oliver looked down. The cat had already fallen asleep again. He couldn't help but laugh quietly. For the first time in a very long while, he realized he hadn't thought about work for several minutes. Not because he was trying not to. He had simply forgotten. Outside, the stars continued appearing one by one above the quiet lane, while inside the little bookshop, the evening unfolded exactly as it always had, without rushing a single moment. And for Oliver, that felt like discovering something he hadn't known he had been searching for. End of Part 2. Samuel settled into an old rocking chair near the fireplace, the kind that had clearly welcomed countless evenings. It gave a gentle creak as it moved, not from age alone, but from years of keeping quiet company. Oliver chose the armchair across from him. Neither of them hurried to speak. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt complete. The fire filled the room with soft pops and whispers. Shadows drifted lazily across the shelves, giving the impression that the books themselves were settling in for the night. After a while, Samuel looked toward the nearest window. "Do you know what I enjoy most about evenings?" Oliver thought for a moment. "The quiet." "That," Samuel said with a smile. "But also the permission." Permission. Morning always asks us to become something. Be productive. Be early. Be prepared. He lifted his teacup. But evening asks almost nothing. Oliver considered those words. Most evenings, he treated the end of the workday as another race. Dinner. Laundry. Emails he forgot to answer. Tomorrow's schedule. News headlines. One more glance at his phone before bed that somehow became 40 minutes. He couldn't remember the last evening that had simply been evening. Samuel stood and wandered toward one of the tallest shelves. "I have something I'd like to show you." He climbed the rolling ladder with surprising ease and reached for a small blue book tucked between much larger volumes. Its cover was plain linen with no title. When he returned, he placed it carefully on the small table between them. Oliver looked at it curiously. "There's no name." Samuel nodded. "Not every book tells you what it contains before you're ready." He opened the first page. Instead of chapters, there was only a single handwritten sentence. "Every ordinary day hides one beautiful moment." Oliver smiled. "That's all." For the first page. Samuel turned another. The second page contained only a watercolor painting. An old wooden dock stretching across a quiet lake at sunrise. Nothing else. No explanation. No story. Just stillness. Page after page continued the same way. A child reading beneath a tree. Fresh bread cooling beside an open window. Snow collecting on an empty park bench. A grandfather tying fishing line. Rain sliding slowly down old glass. Someone watering tomatoes at sunset. Tiny moments that most people would probably walk past without noticing. "They're beautiful," Oliver said quietly. Samuel closed the book. "This isn't a book about extraordinary lives." "What is it about?" "Paying attention." Oliver looked around the shop again. He suddenly noticed details that had escaped him before. A tiny brass telescope resting on the windowsill. Pressed maple leaves framed between two shelves. Handmade bookmarks hanging from a small wooden stand. The steady swing of a pendulum clock whose ticking blended so naturally with the fireplace that it almost sounded like breathing. Everything seemed to invite slower observation. Samuel noticed his wandering eyes. The shop likes rewarding people who slow down. Oliver laughed. "The shop likes. I've owned this place for 42 years. He smiled toward the shelves. "I still believe it has its own personality." Oliver couldn't argue with that. Some buildings simply felt alive. Not because they moved or spoke, but because generations had filled them with conversations, laughter, quiet afternoons, and memories that somehow remained in the walls. Samuel walked toward the front window. "You know what's interesting?" "What?" "Most people never see this place." Oliver blinked. "What do you mean?" "They walk right past the lane." "But it's not hidden." "No." Samuel shook his head gently. "It's simply overlooked." Outside, two people strolled along the main street carrying shopping bags. Neither turned toward the narrow cobblestone lane. A cyclist passed. A family laughed together as they crossed the square. Life continued comfortably around them. "But you found it." Oliver watched the warm lantern outside the shop door. "I almost didn't." Samuel nodded. "Almost." For a few moments, Neither of them spoke. The orange cat lifted its head, stretched each paw with careful determination, then wandered toward a nearby bookshelf. It stopped in front of the lowest shelf and gently tapped a single book with its paw. The book tipped forward just enough to lean against the others. Samuel chuckled. "I suppose that's his recommendation." Oliver walked over. The book's cover showed an illustration of a winding country road disappearing into rolling hills beneath a wide evening sky. Its title read, "Where Nothing Needed to Happen." "I like that title," Oliver said. "So do many people." Samuel smiled. "They usually choose it after a particularly busy week." Oliver opened to the first page. There were no dramatic openings, no mysteries, no heroes racing against time. The first sentence simply read, "The road was quiet enough that you could hear your own footsteps becoming lighter." He read it again, then once more. Somehow, those words slowed his breathing. He looked up. "Do people actually come here to buy books?" Samuel's smile grew warmer. "Sometimes. And other times, they come to remember how it feels not to hurry." Outside, the last traces of blue disappeared from the sky. The stars settled comfortably above the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the passing hour with gentle confidence. Inside the little shop, however, nothing seemed to change. The fire still glowed. The lamps still shone softly. The shelves stood patiently. And for the first time in many months, Oliver realized he had gone an entire hour without wondering what time it was. It wasn't because he had forgotten the world outside. It was because, for this one peaceful evening, the world outside had quietly agreed to wait. End of Part 3. The church bell faded into the distance until it became just another gentle thread woven into the evening. Oliver remained standing beside the bookshelf, holding Where Nothing Needed to Happen. He hadn't read more than a single sentence, yet somehow the book already felt familiar. Samuel noticed the thoughtful look on his face. "Go ahead," he said. "Find a place that feels comfortable." Oliver settled into a chair near one of the tall windows. From there he could see the quiet lane outside. The lanterns cast soft circles of light across the cobblestones, and every now and then a leaf drifted slowly past, carried by a breeze too gentle to hurry anywhere. He opened the book again. The pages felt pleasantly thick beneath his fingertips. The story began with someone walking along a country road just before sunset. There was no destination, no deadline, only fields of tall grass moving like waves beneath the wind. As Oliver read, something curious happened. The sounds of the little bookshop blended naturally with the words on the page. The crackling fire became the distant rustle of dry grass. The ticking clock became slow footsteps along the road. Even the scent of cedar seemed to belong inside the story. After several pages, he realized he wasn't reading quickly. Normally, he skimmed. Years of emails and reports had trained his eyes to search for information rather than experience it. Tonight was different. Every sentence invited him to linger. He reached the end of a page and found himself looking back through it, not because he'd forgotten anything, but because he wanted to spend another quiet moment there. Across the room, Samuel was carefully dusting the shelves. Not hurriedly, not as another task to finish. Each movement carried the calm rhythm of someone who believed ordinary work could be peaceful. He picked up a small porcelain bird from one shelf, polished it gently with a soft cloth, admired it for a second, and returned it to exactly the same place. Oliver smiled. There was something reassuring about watching someone care for familiar things. After a while, Samuel wandered over carrying a small wooden tray. On it rested 2 freshly baked cookies. "They're still warm." Oliver looked up. "You bake too?" Samuel laughed. "Oh, goodness, no." He pointed toward the neighboring building. "My friend Clara owns the bakery next door." "The one with the cinnamon rolls?" You noticed. They smelled wonderful. They always do. Samuel handed him one of the cookies. Every evening, just before she closes, she brings over whatever is left. Oliver broke off a small piece. The cookie was crisp around the edges and soft in the middle, filled with oats, honey, and just enough cinnamon to make the room feel even warmer. It tastes like autumn. Samuel nodded with quiet satisfaction. That's exactly what Clara says. Outside, a light breeze stirred the ivy climbing the brick walls. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes answered with soft, wandering notes. Neither sound interrupted the silence. They simply became part of it. Oliver looked around the shop again. Do many people visit after sunset? A few. They must be regulars. Some have been coming for years. Samuel smiled toward the front door. They rarely arrive together. Why not? I think everyone likes believing they've discovered the place on their own. Oliver laughed softly. I know the feeling. Samuel leaned comfortably against one of the shelves. You'd be surprised how many people simply wander in. What kind of people? Oh. He counted thoughtfully on his fingers. A nurse after a long shift. A school principal on Friday evenings. A retired carpenter. A young violin teacher. A mail carrier. A couple celebrating their 40th anniversary. He paused. And once, a little boy who spent nearly an hour explaining dinosaurs to my cat. Oliver looked toward the orange cat. How did he take it? The cat. Samuel smiled. He listened very politely. As if hearing his name mentioned without actually understanding it, the cat opened one eye. He stretched with remarkable seriousness before climbing onto the wide windowsill. There he curled into a neat circle, placing his tail carefully around himself. Within moments he was asleep again. I think I envy him, Oliver said. Samuel chuckled. He has very simple priorities. Sleep, sunlight, an occasional cookie crumb, and absolutely no meetings. Oliver laughed louder than he expected. The sound echoed gently through the room before settling into the quiet. It felt good to laugh without checking who might be listening. A few minutes later the front door opened. The little brass bell rang once. A cool breath of evening air slipped inside. An elderly woman entered wearing a blue wool sweater and carrying a woven basket filled with fresh herbs. She paused just inside the doorway. Good evening, Samuel. Good evening, Margaret. You've brought rosemary again. And thyme. She lifted the basket slightly. The garden has been generous. Samuel accepted the herbs with genuine appreciation. The tea will thank you. Margaret noticed Oliver and offered a warm smile that carried no curiosity, only kindness. You must be new. I suppose I am. I hope you found a comfortable chair. I have. Good. She nodded as though that settled something important. No evening should be spent in an uncomfortable chair. Oliver smiled. I completely agree. Margaret wandered toward a nearby shelf as though she'd visited 100 times before. Perhaps she had. She selected a single book, opened it, and began reading beneath one of the lamps without another word. The shop welcomed her quiet presence as naturally as it welcomed the fire, the shelves, or the sleeping cat. No introductions were needed. No conversations were expected. Everyone simply shared the same peaceful room. Oliver leaned back in his chair. Outside, another leaf drifted slowly past the window. Inside, the fire glowed with steady warmth, pages turned softly, and the comforting scent of fresh rosemary joined the cedar, tea, and old books. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the evening asked nothing of him except to be exactly where he already was. End of Part 4. Margaret turned another page with the same care someone might use while folding a cherished letter. The room remained wonderfully quiet. Not silent, but alive with the gentle sounds that often go unnoticed. The whisper of paper. The crackle of a log settling in the fireplace. The faint clink of porcelain as Samuel arranged teacups behind the counter. Oliver found himself listening to those sounds the way one might listen to rain. They didn't ask for attention. They simply made the room feel complete. After a while, Samuel disappeared through a small doorway near the back of the shop. Curiosity eventually encouraged Oliver to stand and wander once more between the shelves. Each aisle seemed to have its own quiet personality. One was devoted to travel journals. Not stories about racing across continents or climbing dangerous mountains, but gentle accounts of long train rides, seaside villages, and slow afternoons in forgotten towns. Another shelf held cookbooks. Their pages weren't filled with complicated recipes. Instead, they celebrated simple meals. Fresh tomato soup. Apple pie cooling on a windowsill. Homemade bread. Vegetable stew that simmered all afternoon while friends gathered around the kitchen table. Oliver smiled to himself. These weren't books about impressing people. They were books about comforting them. Near the back of the shop, he discovered a small handwritten sign. Books that feel like coming home. The shelf beneath it was nearly empty. Only 4 books remained. He reached toward one called The Porch Light Was Still On. Before he could open it, Samuel returned carrying a small watering can made of polished copper. I wondered when someone would notice that shelf. Oliver held up the book. It seems popular. It is. Samuel carefully watered a collection of green plants resting along the windows. There were ferns, ivy, rosemary, and tiny pots of lavender. Each looked healthy enough to have lived there for years. People often think they're searching for excitement. He touched the leaves of a fern with gentle fingertips. But after enough busy days, they're searching for comfort, Oliver guessed. Samuel smiled. Exactly. He finished watering the last plant and set the can aside. Comfort is an underrated treasure. Oliver looked around. Everything in the room seemed built around that very idea. The chairs were soft without being luxurious. The blankets folded neatly over their backs looked handmade. The lamps cast warm pools of light instead of bright glare. Even the shelves were slightly uneven in places, worn smooth by decades of careful hands. Nothing was perfect. Everything was welcoming. Margaret quietly closed her book. She approached the counter carrying it beneath one arm. I'll borrow this one. Samuel glanced at the cover. A good choice. I've read it 7 times. And it gets better every autumn. Samuel laughed. That's because you've changed each time you've read it. Margaret considered that. You may be right. She slipped the book into her basket beside the herbs. As she reached the door, she turned back toward Oliver. Don't wait too long before coming again. I won't. I said the same thing 20 years ago. Oliver blinked. You've been visiting that long? She smiled. Long enough to remember when Samuel's beard was brown. Samuel placed a hand over his heart. That was entirely unnecessary. Margaret laughed quietly. So was getting older. The little brass bell chimed as she stepped outside. For a brief moment the cool evening air entered with her. Then the door closed gently behind her. Oliver watched through the window. Instead of walking directly home, Margaret paused beneath one of the lanterns. She looked up at the stars for several peaceful seconds before continuing down the cobblestone lane. No phone. No rush. Just an evening walk beneath a quiet sky. Samuel noticed Oliver watching. She never skips that part. The stars. Every single evening. Even when it's cold. Especially when it's cold. Oliver smiled. Why? Samuel thought for a moment. She says the stars have been keeping people company long before electricity. The thought lingered comfortably between them. Oliver looked upward through the window. The sky had grown wonderfully clear. Thousands of stars stretched across the darkness like tiny lanterns scattered by a patient hand. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at them for more than a few seconds. Usually they disappeared behind parking garages, office buildings, or the glow of screens. Tonight they seemed brighter. Or perhaps he was simply paying attention. Samuel returned to the counter and opened a small wooden drawer. Inside rested dozens of bookmarks. None were identical. Some had tiny pressed flowers sealed beneath clear paper. Others were painted with forests, lakes, snowy cabins, or quiet country roads. He selected one decorated with a maple leaf turning shades of gold and crimson. "I think this belongs in your book." Oliver accepted it carefully. "It's beautiful. A local artist makes them." He paused. "She says every good story deserves something beautiful waiting between its pages." Oliver slid the bookmark into where nothing needed to happen. It fit perfectly. He looked around the room once more. The fire continued its gentle dance. The cat slept so peacefully it almost seemed to be dreaming on behalf of the entire shop. Outside, the lanterns glowed patiently beside the quiet lane. Then something else caught his attention. Beyond the shelves, through the small doorway where Samuel had disappeared earlier, he noticed another soft light. It wasn't the warm orange glow of the fireplace. This light carried a faint silver tint, as though moonlight had found its way indoors. There appeared to be another room beyond. Or perhaps a garden. Samuel noticed the direction of Oliver's gaze. His smile returned before Oliver could even ask the question. "I wondered how long it would take." Oliver looked back at him. "What's back there?" Samuel glanced toward the softly lit doorway. "My favorite place in the whole shop." He picked up a lantern from beside the counter. "If you're not quite ready for the evening to end." He lifted the lantern, its warm light joining the softer glow beyond. "There's someone I'd very much like you to meet." End of Part 5. Samuel lifted the lantern from its hook beside the counter. Its glass panels glowed with a warm amber light that seemed softer than electricity and steadier than candlelight. As he walked, the lantern painted gentle circles across the old wooden floor. Oliver followed. The doorway at the back of the shop was lower than he expected. A small brass plaque beside it simply read, "Please walk slowly." He smiled. "I don't think I've ever seen a sign like that." Samuel glanced over his shoulder. Most places ask people not to run. And this one reminds people they don't have to. Oliver ducked beneath the doorway. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, lined with framed watercolor paintings. Each picture showed an ordinary moment. An old bicycle resting beneath an oak tree. Fresh laundry moving gently in the wind. A fishing boat tied quietly to a wooden dock. Someone reading beneath a quilt on a rainy afternoon. There were no famous landmarks. No dramatic landscapes. Just peaceful scenes that felt oddly familiar, as though they belonged to everyone's memories. The hallway ended at another wooden door. Samuel pushed it open. Cool evening air drifted inside. Oliver stepped through and stopped without realizing it. Behind the little bookshop was a garden unlike any he had expected. Not grand. Not perfectly arranged. Simply loved. Stone paths curved gently between flower beds overflowing with lavender, chamomile, rosemary, and white daisies. Small lanterns rested among the plants, their warm light blending with the pale glow of the rising moon. An ancient maple tree stood near the center of the garden. Its broad branches spread overhead like welcoming arms. Beneath it rested a long wooden bench polished smooth by countless evenings. The leaves above whispered softly whenever the breeze wandered through. "I had no idea this was here," Oliver said. Most people don't. Samuel closed the door quietly behind them. The shop receives plenty of attention. The garden prefers introductions. Oliver breathed deeply. The air smelled wonderfully clean. Fresh earth. Lavender. Mint. The faint sweetness of blooming jasmine somewhere nearby. After spending so much of his life breathing conditioned office air and city traffic, the simple freshness felt almost luxurious. A narrow stream wound through one corner of the garden. Its water moved so gently that it barely made a sound. Instead of rushing, it seemed content to continue at its own peaceful pace. A tiny wooden bridge crossed over it. Samuel noticed Oliver watching the water. I built that bridge 30 years ago. You did. My first attempt leaned quite a bit. Oliver laughed. What happened? I left it that way. Really? Samuel nodded. It reminded me that useful things don't have to be perfect. They crossed the little bridge together. On the other side stood several raised garden beds filled with vegetables. Tomatoes ripened quietly on their vines. Rows of lettuce caught the moonlight. Basil released its wonderful fragrance each time the breeze passed. There are vegetables back here too? Oh yes. Samuel smiled. The bakery uses some. So Clara visits often. Almost every day. Oliver imagined the elderly baker walking across the little bridge each morning, basket in hand, collecting herbs before opening her shop. The picture felt strangely comforting. Everything here seemed connected. Books, tea, gardens, bread, neighbors, evenings. Nothing existed entirely by itself. As they continued walking, they reached the maple tree. Its trunk was enormous, easily wider than both of them standing shoulder to shoulder. The bark carried deep grooves shaped by more than a century of changing seasons. Samuel placed a gentle hand against it. She's older than the shop. You call the tree she? I've known her a long time. Oliver rested his own hand on the rough bark. It felt cool beneath his fingertips. Solid. Patient. The kind of patience only trees seem to possess. Every autumn, Samuel said quietly, she gives us enough leaves to cover the entire garden. That sounds like a lot of raking. It is. Worth it. Samuel looked upward into the branches. Every single leaf. They settled onto the bench beneath the tree. For several minutes neither spoke. The moon climbed a little higher. Somewhere beyond the garden fence, an owl called once before returning to silence. Tiny crickets carried on their endless evening conversation. Oliver leaned back against the bench. I didn't realize how noisy my life had become. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Most people don't. I thought I liked staying busy. You probably do. Oliver looked at him. There's nothing wrong with meaningful work. Samuel folded his hands comfortably. The trouble begins when we forget the difference between being busy and being alive. The words lingered gently in the cool evening air. Oliver watched a single maple leaf drift slowly downward. It landed on the stream and floated away without urgency. He realized the leaf wasn't trying to reach anywhere. The water would carry it exactly where it belonged. Samuel smiled as though reading his thoughts. The garden teaches quietly. What does it teach? That growth happens slowly. He gestured toward the flowers. None of these blooms hurried. Toward the tree. The maple didn't become this tall in a season. Toward the stream. Even water shapes stone by taking its time. Oliver breathed in the scent of lavender once more. Somewhere inside him, the constant pressure to always be accomplishing something seemed to loosen another small degree. He hadn't solved any problems tonight. He hadn't answered any emails. He hadn't crossed a single task off a list. Yet somehow, he felt lighter than he had all week. A soft flutter interrupted the quiet. A tiny brown bird landed on one of the lower branches above the bench. It tucked its head beneath a wing, already preparing for sleep. Samuel looked up with a warm smile. Right on schedule. It sleeps here every night, as long as I've noticed. The little bird shifted slightly, growing still again. The maple tree held it gently above them, just as it had likely sheltered generations of birds before. Oliver couldn't help smiling. The whole garden seemed to understand something the rest of the world often forgot. That the day didn't need to end with one last task. Sometimes it could simply end with gratitude, fresh air, and a quiet place beneath an old tree. They remained there as the lantern beside the bench cast its gentle glow across the winding path, while the little bookshop behind them waited patiently, its windows shining like warm stars in the peaceful New England night. End of Part 6. The lantern beside the bench burned with a steady glow. It wasn't especially bright, yet it seemed to illuminate exactly what it needed to. The winding path, the old maple tree, the little bridge over the stream. Beyond that, the rest of the garden was left to the soft silver light of the moon. Oliver found that he liked the balance. Not everything needed to be fully seen. Some things were perfectly content to remain gentle outlines beneath the night sky. A breeze wandered through the branches above them. The maple leaves answered with a quiet rustling sound, almost like pages turning somewhere high overhead. Samuel listened for a moment. Every season has its own music. Oliver tilted his head. I've never thought about that. Most people are too busy hearing engines. They both smiled. Samuel pointed toward the flower beds. In spring, it's bees. He gestured toward the stream. In summer, moving water. Then to the maple. In autumn, leaves. Finally, toward the quiet sky. And winter. He paused. Winter teaches us how beautiful silence can be. Oliver imagined snow settling across the garden, covering the paths, resting gently on the bridge, gathering along the branches until everything became peaceful and still. It sounded less like loneliness and more like rest. I think I'd like to see this place in winter. I hope you do. Samuel stood slowly from the bench. Come. They followed the stone path toward the far corner of the garden. There, tucked behind a row of lavender bushes, stood a small greenhouse. Its wooden frame had weathered gracefully over the years, and every pane of glass reflected tiny stars from above. Inside, dozens of plants rested quietly. Some were young herbs. Others were flowering vines climbing slender supports. Small lemon trees filled the room with the faintest citrus fragrance. A tiny fountain rested in one corner, its water falling gently into a stone basin with a sound so soft it barely rose above a whisper. Oliver stepped inside. The warmth surprised him. Not hot, just comfortably warmer than the cool evening outside. It feels like another little world. Samuel smiled. I spend many mornings here. He gently touched the leaf of a young fig tree. Plants don't care about deadlines. Oliver laughed. They probably don't. They don't compare themselves either. Samuel looked around the greenhouse with quiet affection. This rosemary doesn't wish it were lavender. This fern doesn't dream of becoming an oak. They simply grow. Oliver watched tiny droplets of water resting on the leaves. Each reflected the lantern light like a miniature star. I suppose people could learn from that. Samuel nodded. We spend so much time wondering whether we're doing enough. He paused beside a tray of seedlings. Nature spends that same time becoming exactly what it already is. Oliver looked down at the tiny green sprouts. Some had only just broken through the soil. Others were already reaching upward. None appeared hurried. None seemed behind. Each simply followed its own quiet rhythm. Near the back wall stood an old wooden table covered with clay pots. Some held herbs. Others waited empty. A folded envelope rested neatly beside them. Samuel picked it up. "Clara leaves me notes." Oliver smiled. "What kind of notes?" "Oh." Samuel unfolded the paper. "The basil looks happier this week." He chuckled. "Save me 2 sprigs of mint tomorrow." Another line made him laugh a little more. "You still owe me a loaf of sourdough for borrowing your watering can." Oliver grinned. "You keep score over a watering can?" "We've been arguing about that watering can for 12 years. 12. Neither of us remembers who originally owned it." The image made Oliver laugh. Some disagreements, he thought, existed only because they had become traditions. Samuel folded the note and slipped it back where he had found it. Friendship becomes wonderfully simple after enough years. Outside, the moon climbed a little higher. Its light filtered gently through the greenhouse roof, blending with the warm lantern hanging above the work table. For a moment, the room seemed suspended between moonlight and firelight, neither one competing with the other. Oliver wandered toward a narrow shelf filled with tiny clay pots. Each contained a single seedling. Small handwritten labels identified them. Lavender, thyme, sage, chamomile. One pot, however, carried no label at all. "What grows here?" Samuel walked over. He looked at the little green shoot and smiled. "We're waiting to find out." "You planted something without knowing?" "A bird probably did." Oliver looked puzzled. Samuel pointed toward one of the open windows near the roof. "They occasionally leave little surprises." "So you just let it grow?" "Of course. What if it's only a weed?" Samuel shrugged gently. "Then it will have had a peaceful place to spend a little time." Oliver found himself smiling again. It seemed perfectly fitting. This garden wasn't trying to control every outcome. It simply made room for life. As they stepped back outside, the night felt even quieter than before. The stars stretched from one horizon to the other. The air carried the comforting fragrance of lavender and damp earth. From somewhere beyond the fence came the faint hoot of the same owl, beginning another slow patrol of the night. They returned toward the maple tree at an easy pace. Neither one felt the need to hurry back inside. Ahead, the windows of the little bookshop glowed warmly through the branches, looking less like a business and more like a welcoming home. Oliver realized he had stopped thinking about tomorrow altogether. The meetings would come. The emails would still be waiting. Morning would arrive exactly when it always did. But tonight belonged to something else. Tonight belonged to quiet conversations, old trees, warm lanterns, and the comforting realization that not every hour needed to be productive to be meaningful. The little bookshop seemed to understand that better than any place he had ever known. And somehow, without asking for anything in return, it was gently teaching him to understand it too. End of Part 7. They reached the maple tree once more, but instead of returning directly to the shop, Samuel turned toward a narrow path Oliver hadn't noticed before. It curved gently behind a hedge of rosemary and disappeared beneath an arch woven with climbing roses. Even at night, a few pale blossoms remained open, carrying a delicate fragrance that drifted through the cool air. "There always seems to be one more path," Oliver said. Samuel chuckled. "I found that's true in gardens and in life." As they walked beneath the arch, the sounds of the town seemed to fade even farther away. The little stream still murmured behind them, but now another sound joined it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not loud enough to interrupt the quiet. Just steady enough to notice. "What is that?" Oliver asked. Samuel smiled. "You'll see." The path ended beside a tiny wooden shed no larger than a backyard playhouse. Its walls were painted a soft sage green, and window boxes overflowed with tiny white flowers. From inside came the gentle tapping again. Samuel opened the door. The room was simple. One workbench stretched beneath the window. Shelves held jars of paintbrushes, pencils, fountain pens, folded paper, and carefully wound balls of twine. An old clock rested on the wall, though its hands had stopped at 7:23 years ago. Oliver looked at it. "It doesn't work." Samuel followed his gaze. "It stopped one autumn evening. You never repaired it." "I thought about it." "What changed your mind?" Samuel smiled. "I realized there were already plenty of clocks telling me what time it was." He looked around the little workshop. "I didn't need another one." Oliver laughed softly. That answer somehow felt exactly right. The tapping came again. This time Oliver noticed its source. Rain wasn't falling. No branches touched the roof. Instead, one corner of the room held a small wooden wind spinner just outside the open window. Every now and then the breeze turned it gently, and a tiny wooden bead tapped softly against the frame. Tap. A pause. Tap. Another pause. The rhythm was wonderfully unimportant. No urgency. No countdown. Just the wind making quiet conversation with wood. Samuel picked up a small notebook from the workbench. Its leather cover had faded until it was almost the color of chestnuts. He handed it to Oliver. "Open any page." Oliver did. Every page held only a few lines. Some contained observations. Others were little memories. One simply read, "The first robin returned today before breakfast." Another said, "The bakery smelled like apples all afternoon." A few pages later, someone laughed outside the shop without realizing they needed to. Oliver smiled. "They're not diary entries." "No." "What are they?" Samuel considered the question. "I suppose they're moments I didn't want to lose." Oliver slowly turned another page. The moon reflected perfectly in the bird bath tonight. Another. A child asked whether clouds ever get tired. Another. Fresh bread shared with a neighbor always tastes better. There were no grand achievements. No lists of accomplishments. Just ordinary pieces of life, carefully noticed before they drifted away. "You filled dozens of these." "I have." "Do you ever read them again?" "Every winter." Oliver looked surprised. "Why winter?" "Because gardens sleep." Samuel smiled toward the window. "And while they rest, I remember all the little things they gave me during the warmer months." Oliver closed the notebook gently. "I don't think I'd have much to write." Samuel looked at him kindly. "You might be surprised." He pulled a blank notebook from the shelf. It was smaller than the others, bound in blue cloth with cream-colored pages. "You don't have to write every day." Oliver accepted it. "What should I write?" "Anything that made you pause." Samuel smiled. "The way sunlight landed on your kitchen table." "A stranger holding the door." "The smell of coffee before the first sip." "The sound of rain after a warm afternoon." He shrugged gently. "The world quietly offers beautiful moments all the time. We're simply looking somewhere else." Oliver ran his thumb across the blank cover. He hadn't kept a journal since college. Back then, he'd filled pages with goals, deadlines, and plans. This felt different. There was no pressure to improve. Only an invitation to notice. Outside, the breeze turned the little wind spinner once again. Tap. The bead touched the frame. Tap. Oliver listened. "I think I understand why you left the broken clock." Samuel smiled. "Do you?" "It reminds you that not everything has to measure time." Samuel's eyes brightened. "I couldn't have said it better." They stepped back outside. The workshop door closed quietly behind them. The moonlight washed gently across the garden paths, turning every stone a soft shade of silver. Near the stream, tiny frogs had begun their evening chorus. The sound blended naturally with the crickets and the whispering leaves. Nothing competed. Everything belonged. As they walked toward the bookshop, Oliver slipped the little blue notebook into his coat pocket. It wasn't heavy, yet somehow it felt more valuable than the expensive planner he carried every day for work. One organized his schedule. The other, he suspected, might help him remember his life. Ahead, the warm windows of the bookshop welcomed them home once again. The orange cat was visible through the glass, still asleep on the windowsill, completely unconcerned with the passing hours. Oliver smiled. Perhaps the cat had understood all along what people spent years trying to learn. The brass bell above the door gave its familiar gentle chime as Samuel opened it, and the comforting scent of cedar tea and old books greeted them like an old friend who had been patiently waiting all along. End of Part 8. The familiar warmth of the bookshop welcomed them back as though they had only stepped away for a moment. The fire had settled into glowing embers, sending gentle ribbons of warmth across the room. Shadows danced lazily along the shelves, stretching and shrinking with each quiet flicker. The orange cat looked up as they entered. It blinked slowly, gave a tiny yawn, and, after deciding everything was exactly as it should be, tucked its nose beneath its tail once again. "I'd like to have that level of confidence," Oliver whispered. Samuel smiled. "He trusts that the evening will take care of itself." Oliver hung his coat on the wooden rack beside the door. The little blue notebook rested comfortably in its pocket. For some reason, he was already looking forward to writing in it, even if he only filled a single page. Samuel disappeared behind the counter. "I think we're ready for one last cup of tea." "You've had this planned all evening, haven't you?" "Oh, certainly not." A quiet pause. "I've had it planned since this afternoon." Oliver laughed. From a small cabinet, Samuel selected 2 ceramic mugs that didn't quite match. One was deep forest green. The other carried tiny painted stars scattered across a cream-colored glaze. "I've always preferred mismatched cups," Samuel said as he placed them on the counter. "Why's that?" "They remind me that things don't have to be identical to belong together." He filled a small kettle with fresh water and placed it over the fire. There was no electric whistle, no flashing lights, only the soft beginning of warmth. While they waited, Samuel reached beneath the counter and brought out a round wooden tin. Inside were loose tea leaves in neat little cloth bags. Each carried a handwritten label: evening mint, chamomile and honey, mountain herbs, apple and cinnamon. Oliver leaned closer. "You blended these yourself?" "Most of them." Samuel lifted the bag labeled apple and cinnamon and inhaled its fragrance. "My grandmother taught me. She owned the shop." "No." Samuel smiled fondly. "She simply believed tea deserved as much attention as conversation." Oliver liked that thought. So many things in life were prepared while thinking about the next task. Here, every small ritual seemed complete in itself. The kettle began to murmur softly. Samuel measured the tea leaves with careful hands, never rushing the process. Outside, a faint breeze brushed against the windows, carrying with it the scent of damp earth from the garden. The shop seemed to breathe with the night. As the tea steeped, Oliver wandered toward a shelf he hadn't visited before. Its sign read, "Books returned with gratitude." Unlike the other shelves, these books looked well loved. Some corners were gently worn. Several cloth bindings had faded from years of careful reading. One volume held a tiny pressed fern peeking out between its pages. Another contained a handwritten note tucked inside the cover. Oliver glanced toward Samuel. "Do people leave notes?" "Sometimes." "For you?" Samuel shook his head. "For whoever reads the book next." Oliver opened one at random. A single sentence was written neatly in blue ink. I hope this story finds you on a peaceful evening." He smiled. Another book held a different note. "Read chapter 4 beside an open window if you can." A third simply said, "Take your time." Oliver gently closed the cover. "They're talking to strangers. They're talking to future friends." Samuel poured the tea into their mugs. "I've always believed books introduce people who never meet." Oliver carried both mugs to a small table near the fireplace. The flames had softened into glowing orange light, perfect for a quiet evening. As they sat, Samuel looked thoughtfully toward the shelves. "When I was young, I thought wisdom came from finding answers. And now, I think it comes from learning which questions no longer need asking." Oliver wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "What kind of questions?" Samuel smiled. "Am I far enough ahead? Do I own enough? What does everyone else think?" He took a slow sip of tea. "The older I become." He looked around the peaceful room. "The less interesting those questions seem." Oliver nodded quietly. He remembered how often he'd measured his weeks by completed tasks, unread emails, and appointments still waiting. Yet none of those things had crossed his mind for hours. Instead, he'd remembered the smell of lavender, the sound of a wooden wind spinner, fresh herbs in a basket, a bird sleeping in an old maple tree. Small things, but somehow important things. The fire settled with a gentle crack. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt as comfortable as an old quilt. Then, from somewhere outside, came the faintest sound. 3 slow chimes. Not from the church this time. Lighter. Almost musical. Oliver looked toward the window. What was that? Samuel's eyes brightened with quiet recognition. The clock tower. I didn't know there was one. Most visitors don't. It rings this late. Only once. Samuel stood and walked to the window. It means the town is getting ready to sleep. Oliver joined him. Far beyond the rooftops, barely visible above the trees, stood a small stone clock tower with a copper roof that glimmered beneath the moon. Its face wasn't brightly lit, just enough to catch the silver glow of the night. "I've lived near this town for years," Oliver said softly. "I've never noticed it." Samuel nodded. "It doesn't mind." The two of them stood quietly watching the distant tower. Its hands continued their patient journey around the clock face, asking nothing of anyone. For the first time in a very long while, Oliver didn't see time as something slipping away. It simply felt like another gentle companion moving peacefully through the evening, one quiet minute at a time. Behind them, the little bookshop remained warm and welcoming, its shelves standing like old friends, its fire glowing softly, and its stories waiting patiently for anyone willing to slow down long enough to hear them. End of Part 9. Oliver stood beside the window a little longer, watching the distant clock tower resting quietly above the rooftops. Its hands continued their slow journey, unnoticed by most of the town. "I wonder how many people hear those chimes," he said. Samuel smiled. "Probably fewer every year." "That's a shame." "Perhaps." Samuel rested one hand on the windowsill. "But the tower doesn't ring because someone is listening." Oliver looked at him. "It rings because that's what it was built to do." The thought lingered gently in the room. Outside, a few porch lights winked off one by one as families settled in for the night. Curtains were drawn. Kitchen windows grew dark. The little town seemed to be exhaling after another ordinary day. Samuel glanced toward a narrow staircase tucked beside the tallest bookshelf. "I'd like to show you one last room." Oliver laughed softly. "You've said that at least twice tonight." "I know." Samuel adjusted his glasses with a grin. "But every old building has one more corner." They climbed the staircase slowly. Each wooden step gave a quiet creak, not from weakness but from decades of welcoming, careful footsteps. Halfway up, Oliver noticed framed photographs covering the wall. Black and white portraits. Faded color snapshots. Small handwritten captions beneath each frame. He stopped to look. One photograph showed Samuel many years younger, standing outside the shop with a bicycle leaning against the wall. Another captured Clara smiling proudly beside a table overflowing with fresh bread. There was Margaret planting flowers beneath the maple tree. A mail carrier holding a teacup. A little girl reading beside the fireplace while the orange cat, much younger then, slept beside her shoes. Oliver smiled. "You've photographed everyone." "Not everyone." Samuel climbed another step. "Only the people who forgot they were being photographed." Oliver looked more closely. None of the smiles seemed posed. No one looked toward the camera. They were simply living. Someone laughing. Someone reading. Someone pouring tea. Someone watching snowfall through the front window. The ordinary moments somehow felt more beautiful than formal portraits. At the top of the stairs, the room opened beneath the sloping roof. It was smaller than the shop below. Books filled one wall. A comfortable sofa rested beneath a skylight. An old globe stood quietly in the corner beside a rocking chair. Near the window sat a polished brass telescope. "So this is where the telescope came from." Samuel nodded. "I bring it downstairs during the day." "But at night?" He walked toward the skylight. "It belongs up here." The glass ceiling revealed a remarkable view. The stars stretched across the sky with astonishing clarity. Without the glow of city lights, the Milky Way formed a pale ribbon reaching from one horizon to the other. Oliver found himself whispering, "I haven't seen the sky like this since I was a kid." Samuel gently adjusted the telescope. "Would you like to?" Oliver stepped forward. He looked through the eyepiece. The moon floated into view. Its surface appeared calm and textured, filled with gentle shadows and bright planes that seemed almost close enough to touch. For several long moments he said nothing. Finally he stepped back. "I forgot it looked like that." Samuel smiled knowingly. "We forget many beautiful things." Oliver looked through the telescope again. This time he found a small cluster of stars. Tiny points of light gathered together against the deep blue darkness. He couldn't name them. He didn't need to. Simply seeing them felt enough. Samuel settled into the rocking chair. "My father used to bring me up here." "He owned the shop before you?" "No." Samuel chuckled. "He repaired clocks." Oliver looked surprised. "Really? He spent 40 years helping people keep time." Samuel looked toward the stars. When he retired, he said something I've never forgotten. "What was it?" "I fixed thousands of clocks." He smiled. "Now I'd like to spend whatever time I have left forgetting about them." Oliver laughed quietly. "Did he?" "Oh yes. He planted tomatoes, learned to bake bread, started feeding birds every morning." Samuel's eyes softened with the memory. He told me he finally understood the difference between counting days and enjoying them. The rocking chair creaked gently as he leaned back. For a while they simply watched the stars through the skylight. No conversation seemed necessary. The room itself encouraged stillness. Oliver noticed a small basket beside the sofa. Inside were neatly folded blankets in different colors. "You expect people to stay a while." Samuel nodded. "Sometimes visitors lose track of time." "I can understand why." "They'll look through the telescope, read a chapter, listen to the rain." He smiled. "Occasionally someone falls asleep." Oliver looked around. "I imagine you don't wake them." "Never." Samuel laughed softly. I just place another log on the fire downstairs." A comfortable silence settled once more. Oliver leaned back against the sofa. The stars above seemed almost motionless, though he knew they were traveling through space faster than imagination could easily understand. Yet from this little room above the bookshop, they appeared peaceful, patient, unhurried. Perhaps, he thought, peace had less to do with moving slowly and more to do with not feeling the need to rush. The thought made him smile. Downstairs, the old pendulum clock continued its gentle rhythm. The fire glowed warmly below. The orange cat was almost certainly still asleep in its favorite place. Everything in the little bookshop seemed to understand that evenings were not empty spaces between busy days. They were precious hours all their own. Hours meant for stories, warm tea, quiet conversations, and remembering that life often whispered its greatest joys instead of shouting them. Oliver closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, the stars were still waiting, exactly where they had always been. Patient enough for anyone who finally remembered to look up. End of Part 10. Oliver remained beneath the skylight, his eyes following the slow drift of a single cloud across the stars. It moved so quietly that, had he blinked, he might have thought the sky itself had shifted. "I used to know the constellations," he said. Samuel smiled from the rocking chair. "So did I. You forgot them. Most of the names." Samuel folded his hands comfortably. "But not the feeling. The feeling." Standing outside on a cool evening, looking up, and realizing the world is much larger than whatever worried me that morning. Oliver nodded. He understood exactly what Samuel meant. There was something comforting about the night sky. It didn't solve problems. It simply placed them in gentler perspective. After a while, Samuel stood. "I think it's time for one more tradition." "Another one?" "There are quite a few around here." They made their way back downstairs. The fire had become a bed of glowing embers, radiating a steady warmth that filled the shop without demanding attention. The orange cat stretched dramatically, one paw at a time, before hopping down from the windowsill. It walked toward the front door, then looked back expectantly. "I believe we're being invited," Samuel said. The cat gave a soft, patient meow. "I suppose we are." Samuel opened the door. The brass bell offered its familiar chime as cool night air drifted inside. The cat stepped onto the cobblestones with the confidence of someone who had walked the same path thousands of times. Oliver followed. "So where are we going?" "You'll see." The lane looked even quieter than before. Most of the lanterns still glowed, but many of the nearby homes had turned dark. Only an occasional window remained lit, where someone might still be reading or finishing a late cup of tea. The cat led them at an unhurried pace. Every so often it paused to inspect a flower pot or rub gently against a fence post before continuing. "It seems to know exactly where it's going." "Oh, it does." Samuel smiled. "It simply refuses to hurry." They reached the little bakery. Earlier, its windows had displayed fresh pastries and warm light. Now the curtains were drawn. Only a single lantern burned beside the door. Resting neatly on the front step was a small wicker basket covered with a folded linen cloth. Samuel bent down and lifted it. "Clara leaves this every night. For you. For anyone walking with me." Oliver looked curious. Samuel folded back the cloth. Inside rested 2 small slices of apple cake wrapped in wax paper. Alongside them sat a tiny handwritten note. Samuel read it aloud. "Don't forget to look at the moon before going home." Oliver laughed softly. "She leaves instructions." "Frequently." Samuel turned the note over. On the back was another sentence. "Tomorrow's bread will be rosemary." Oliver shook his head with a smile. "I think I would like Clara." So would everyone. They continued walking. Neither of them ate the cake immediately. Somehow it felt right to carry it for a while. The lane curved gently until it opened into a tiny square with a stone fountain at its center. Water trickled quietly from a simple carved bowl into a circular basin. Unlike the grand fountains in large cities, this one made no attempt to impress. It simply offered the peaceful sound of moving water. Several wooden benches surrounded the square. All were empty. The cat jumped onto one and curled into a comfortable circle beneath a lantern. Samuel sat on another bench and gestured for Oliver to join him. "This is where I end nearly every evening. You come here every night. Unless it's raining. And if it is..." Samuel smiled. "I sit under the bakery awning instead." Oliver looked around the square. A maple leaf drifted onto the surface of the fountain. Instead of sinking, it floated slowly in circles, guided by the gentle current. No one hurried past. No cars interrupted the quiet. The town had fully settled into sleep. Samuel unwrapped one slice of apple cake and handed it to Oliver. It was still surprisingly fresh. The cinnamon and apples carried just enough sweetness to feel comforting without being heavy. "This is wonderful. Clara insists cake tastes better outdoors." Oliver took another bite. "I think she's right." For several peaceful minutes they simply enjoyed the quiet. Then Samuel spoke again. "When I was younger, I thought happiness would arrive all at once." Oliver listened. "I imagined some remarkable day when everything would finally feel complete." He smiled gently. "It never happened." "No, no." Samuel watched the water in the fountain. What happened instead was something much kinder. Oliver waited. Happiness kept arriving in very small pieces. He pointed toward the fountain. "A peaceful evening." Toward the bakery. "Warm bread." Toward the sky. "A clear night." Toward the sleeping cat. "Good company." He looked at Oliver with a gentle smile. The pieces were never very large. But eventually, they filled an entire life. Oliver looked down at the last bite of apple cake in his hand. He thought about all the moments from that evening. The lavender outside the station. The warm light in the bookshop windows. Tea beside the fire. The maple tree. The greenhouse. The little notebook. The telescope. Now this quiet square beneath the stars. None of those moments would ever appear on a resume. None could be crossed off a checklist. Yet together they had become one of the most peaceful evenings he could remember. The fountain continued its gentle song. Somewhere in the distance, a breeze carried the faint scent of rosemary from Clara's bakery. The moon climbed a little higher above the rooftops, bathing the little square in soft silver light. Oliver leaned back against the bench. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about what tomorrow expected from him. He was simply grateful for where he already was. And in that quiet little square, surrounded by warm lanterns, gentle water, and the unhurried company of an old friend, that felt like more than enough. End of Part 11. The fountain continued its quiet conversation with the night. Every few moments, a single drop of water caught the lantern light before slipping into the basin below, sending gentle ripples across the surface. The floating maple leaf turned slowly in a lazy circle, never seeming to mind that it wasn't going anywhere in particular. Oliver watched it for a while. "I've spent so much of my life trying to get somewhere." Samuel nodded. "So have most people. And now..." Oliver smiled faintly. "I find myself admiring a leaf that's perfectly content to drift." Samuel laughed softly. "The leaf has discovered a secret." "What secret?" "That not every journey needs a destination." The breeze carried the scent of pine from somewhere beyond the town. It mingled with a lingering aroma of warm apples and cinnamon from Clara's cake. The combination reminded Oliver of childhood autumns, when evenings arrived earlier and life seemed to unfold at a gentler pace. The orange cat stretched, hopped down from the bench, and wandered toward the fountain. Instead of drinking, it simply sat beside the water, gazing at its own reflection. "I've never met such a thoughtful cat." Samuel smiled. "He spends a great deal of time doing absolutely nothing. Maybe that's why he always looks so peaceful." Perhaps. They sat together without speaking. The silence between them felt like an old friendship that no longer required conversation. Across the square, one upstairs window glowed warmly. A silhouette moved slowly past the curtain before disappearing again. Somewhere inside, someone was likely washing a teacup, closing a book, or turning down the last lamp before bed. Oliver found comfort in imagining all the ordinary endings to ordinary days. No applause. No headlines. Just quiet lives gently coming to rest. After a few minutes, Samuel stood. "There's one more place I'd like to visit before we call it a night." Oliver smiled. "I had a feeling you were going to say that." Samuel laughed. "I suppose I'm predictable. I don't mind." The cat, as though it had been listening all along, stood up and began walking ahead. This time they left the square by a narrow brick path that climbed gently uphill. The town grew quieter with every step. The houses became farther apart. Front gardens gave way to wide lawns bordered by old stone walls. Moonlight rested on neatly trimmed hedges and white picket fences. A porch swing moved slightly in the breeze, though no one sat upon it. Wind chimes answered with a few soft notes before falling silent again. At the top of the hill stood a tiny white gazebo overlooking the town. It was simple in design, with wooden railings and a weathered roof supported by 8 sturdy posts. Climbing roses wound around 2 of the columns, their leaves shimmering silver beneath the moon. Samuel climbed the 3 wooden steps. "This is my favorite view." Oliver joined him. The entire town stretched quietly below. The little bookshop's windows glowed like tiny amber stars. Clara's bakery lantern still burned beside the door. The distant clock tower rose above the rooftops, its face reflecting the moonlight. Farther away, the train station rested peacefully at the edge of town, waiting for tomorrow's first arrivals. "It's beautiful," Oliver whispered. "It always has been." Samuel leaned comfortably against the railing. "The funny thing is..." "What?" "I used to think I needed to travel halfway around the world to find beautiful places. And now..." He gestured toward the sleeping town. "I realized I'd been standing beside one all along." Oliver understood. How often had he rushed past familiar streets without really seeing them? How many sunsets had he missed while looking down at a glowing screen? How many peaceful evenings had quietly slipped away because he believed rest had to be earned? The thought wasn't sad. It simply made him appreciate this evening even more. Above them, the stars filled every corner of the sky. A shooting star crossed the darkness so gently that Oliver almost wondered if he had imagined it. "Did you see that?" Samuel smiled. "I did." "Do you make wishes?" "I used to." "What about now?" Samuel thought for a moment. "Now I mostly say thank you." Oliver looked at him. "For what?" "For being here to notice it." The answer settled warmly in Oliver's heart. No grand wish. No request for more. Just gratitude. They remained in the gazebo for a long while. Neither seemed interested in measuring how much time had passed. The night breeze wandered softly through the open sides of the little structure. The roses released their gentle fragrance. Somewhere down in the valley, an owl called once before returning the night to its peaceful stillness. The orange cat curled into a neat circle beside one of the posts, perfectly content to wait for as long as the humans wished to admire the view. Oliver rested both hands on the smooth wooden railing. He realized something surprising. The tightness that usually lingered in his shoulders had disappeared. His breathing had become slower without him trying. Even the endless stream of thoughts that normally filled every quiet moment had become wonderfully still. There was only the cool night air, the distant glow of warm windows, the comforting company of Samuel, and the quiet certainty that somewhere in the world there would always be places like this, patiently waiting for anyone willing to slow down enough to find them. The town below slept peacefully beneath its blanket of stars, while the little gazebo held its silent watch over another gentle evening that asked nothing more than to be quietly remembered. End of Part 12. The night grew deeper, though it never felt darker. Moonlight rested gently across the rooftops, turning chimney tops and garden fences into pale silver shapes. Somewhere far beyond the town, a freight train sounded its low, distant horn. The sound drifted through the valley like a memory. Oliver listened until it disappeared. "It doesn't seem lonely," he said. "The train?" Samuel nodded. "I've always thought it sounded like someone saying good night." Oliver smiled. "I've never heard it that way. We often hear what we're expecting to hear." Samuel looked toward the horizon. "If we're expecting noise, every sound feels loud. And if we're expecting peace, even a train can become part of it." For a few moments, they simply stood at the railing. The little town below seemed to breathe slowly. A porch light switched off. Another appeared for just a moment before disappearing again. Someone, somewhere, was probably checking one last lock before bed. Someone else was finishing the final chapter of a favorite novel. Someone might even be standing at their own window, looking up at the same sky. Oliver liked that thought. Though strangers rarely met, they often shared the same quiet moments without realizing it. The orange cat stood, stretched carefully from nose to tail, and wandered toward the gazebo steps. "I think our guide has made another decision," Samuel said. "He seems very certain of himself." "He usually is." They followed him down the hill. Instead of returning directly to the bookshop, the cat took a narrow footpath that wound between two old stone walls. The grass growing beside it brushed gently against Oliver's shoes. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze. Tiny white blossoms reflected the moonlight like scattered stars that had settled upon the earth. Halfway along the path, they reached a small wooden gate. It stood open. Beyond it lay a meadow. Not large, just wide enough to let the sky feel even bigger. Tall grasses swayed gently from side to side. Fireflies floated above them, their tiny lights rising and falling without any pattern Oliver could understand. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Samuel smiled. "I come here whenever I need reminding." "Reminding of what?" "That nature has never once looked at a clock." They stepped into the meadow. The grass made a soft whispering sound around their ankles. The air smelled faintly of clover and fresh earth. A few crickets continued their patient evening concert, while somewhere farther away, frogs answered from a hidden pond. Nothing seemed rehearsed. Nothing seemed arranged. Yet everything belonged together. Near the center of the meadow rested an old wooden swing hanging from the broad branch of a solitary oak tree. Its ropes were thick and well cared for, though the seat showed the smooth polish that only many years of use could create. Samuel rested a hand on it. "My father built this. The same one who repaired clocks. The very same." Oliver ran his fingers lightly across the wood. "It's held up remarkably well." Samuel chuckled. He built things expecting them to outlive him. A gentle breeze nudged the swing. It moved forward only a few inches before drifting back again. No one sat on it. It simply responded to the wind. Oliver found himself watching its slow rhythm. Forward, back, forward, back. There was something unexpectedly calming about its movement. "It reminds me of breathing," he said. Samuel looked at the swing. "I've never thought of that." They stood quietly until the swing came almost completely to rest. Not because it had stopped, because it no longer needed to move very much. The cat climbed onto the wooden seat, circled twice, and settled there as though it had reserved the spot long ago. "I suppose he's claimed it." Samuel laughed softly. "He shares it occasionally." Oliver smiled. "I'll wait my turn." Samuel leaned comfortably against the oak tree. "You know, when I was younger, I believed peace came from finding the perfect place. And now, I think peace comes from arriving fully wherever you already are." Oliver looked across the meadow. The grasses shimmered beneath the moon. Fireflies drifted without hurry. The distant town glowed softly beyond the hill. He realized that none of those things had been trying to impress him. They were simply existing. Perhaps that was why they felt so peaceful. The world was not asking him to become someone different. It was simply inviting him to notice. A cool breeze wandered through the oak branches. Several leaves fluttered gently downward, turning lazily through the air before coming to rest among the tall grass. Oliver watched one land near his feet. Without thinking, he bent down and picked it up. Its edges had begun to turn shades of amber and crimson. Autumn was quietly making its first promises. He slipped the leaf carefully inside the little blue notebook resting in his coat pocket. Samuel noticed. "A fine bookmark. I think I'd like to remember tonight." "You will. But memories fade." Samuel smiled warmly. "They soften." He looked around the moonlit meadow. "And sometimes that's even better." The three of them remained beneath the old oak tree while the swing rocked ever so slightly in the breeze. The fireflies continued their gentle dance, and the peaceful little town rested below, wrapped in the quiet certainty that another beautiful day had ended exactly as it should. End of Part 13. The meadow rested beneath the stars as though it had been waiting all day for the moon to arrive. Oliver stood beneath the old oak tree, his hand still resting on the little blue notebook in his coat pocket. Inside it, the autumn leaf lay safely between two blank pages. It wasn't a souvenir. Not exactly. It felt more like a quiet promise to remember. The breeze slowed. Even the tall grass seemed to settle for a while, standing almost perfectly still beneath the silver light. The orange cat finally decided it had occupied the swing long enough. With surprising grace, it jumped to the ground and wandered toward Oliver, brushing gently against his leg before continuing along the path. "I think that's your invitation," Samuel said. "To what?" "The swing." Oliver looked at it for a moment. "I haven't been on one in years." "Then tonight seems like a good evening." He sat down carefully. The wooden seat was cool but smooth, polished by countless evenings just like this one. Oliver pushed gently with the tips of his shoes. The swing moved forward. Only a little. Then back again. There was no reason to go higher. No reason to go faster. The small movement was enough. The ropes gave the faintest creak, joining the quiet chorus of crickets and distant frogs. Samuel watched with a contented smile. "My grandfather used to tell me something whenever we came here." "What was that?" "He'd say, 'Don't pump your legs too hard.'" Oliver laughed softly. "Why not?" "Because you'll spend more time trying to stay in the air than enjoying the breeze." Oliver let the swing slow naturally. The words lingered. How often had he spent his days trying to stay ahead of everything? The next deadline. The next meeting. The next weekend. The next vacation. Always looking toward what came after instead of where he already was. The swing drifted gently back and forth. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. Each movement seemed to smooth another corner of his busy thoughts. Samuel wandered a few steps into the meadow and looked up at the sky. The stars seem especially bright tonight. Oliver followed his gaze. "They do. My grandmother had an explanation." What was it? Samuel smiled. She believed stars shine a little brighter whenever someone finally remembers to look up. Oliver chuckled. That's probably not scientific. Not even a little. But it's comforting. I've always thought so. The cat settled into the grass nearby, watching a firefly drift lazily past its nose. It considered chasing the tiny light. Then, apparently deciding the effort wasn't worthwhile, it lay back down. Oliver smiled. He really has mastered the art of conserving energy. Samuel laughed. He only spends it on important things, like napping and accepting compliments. The moon climbed higher. Its light filtered through the branches of the old oak, creating delicate patterns across the ground. The fireflies seemed fewer now, their tiny lanterns blinking more slowly as the night deepened. Somewhere beyond the meadow came the gentle rustle of something moving through the grass. A moment later, a family of rabbits appeared. 3 small ones followed a larger rabbit across the edge of the field. They paused briefly, their ears turning toward the humans. Samuel and Oliver remained perfectly still. After deciding there was nothing to fear, the rabbits continued on their quiet journey before disappearing among the wildflowers. Oliver exhaled softly. They trusted us. They trusted our stillness. Samuel spoke so quietly that the words almost blended with the breeze. Nature notices when we're calm. Oliver wasn't sure whether that was true, but it certainly felt true. The meadow itself seemed more welcoming the longer they remained peaceful. Nothing fled. Nothing hid. The night simply continued around them. After several more gentle swings, Oliver allowed the seat to come to rest. He stood, brushing a few blades of grass from his coat. I'd forgotten how relaxing that is. Samuel nodded. Some pleasures wait very patiently for us to rediscover them. They began walking slowly toward the edge of the meadow. The cat led the way once more, its tail held comfortably upright. Near the wooden gate, Samuel stopped beside a small stone marker half hidden beneath climbing time. Oliver hadn't noticed it before. There were no dates carved into the stone. No names. Only a single sentence. Leave a little peace wherever you go. Oliver read it twice. I like that. So do I. Samuel gently brushed a fallen leaf from the top of the stone. I think it's the closest thing this town has to a motto. Oliver looked back across the moonlit meadow one last time. The swing had already become still again. The rabbits were gone. The fireflies continued their quiet dance. Everything looked exactly as it had before they arrived. Yet somehow, he felt the meadow would always remember that they had been there. Not because they had changed it, but because it had quietly changed them. As they stepped through the little gate, Oliver reached into his coat pocket and took out the blue notebook. He opened to the very first page. For a moment, he simply held the pencil above the paper. Then he wrote a single sentence. Tonight I remembered that peace doesn't have to be found. Sometimes it is already waiting where you choose to slow down. He looked at the words. They weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. Samuel glanced at the page and smiled without reading it. You've begun. I have. The first page is always the hardest. Oliver closed the notebook gently. It didn't feel hard. Samuel looked toward the softly glowing town below. That's because tonight, you weren't writing to impress anyone. They continued down the winding path together, carrying nothing more than a notebook, the memory of a quiet meadow, and the comforting feeling that some evenings stay with us long after they have ended. Ahead, the warm windows of the little bookshop waited patiently once again, their gentle light shining through the trees like a beacon for anyone who had forgotten that home could sometimes be a feeling as much as a place. End of Part 14. The path back to the bookshop felt even quieter than before. Perhaps the town had grown stiller. Or perhaps Oliver had. The lanterns along the cobblestone lane glowed with a gentle amber light, each one creating a small island of warmth beneath the cool night sky. Their soft reflections shimmered on the smooth stones that generations of footsteps had polished over the years. The orange cat walked a few paces ahead, pausing every now and then to glance back, making sure neither of the humans had wandered off. "I think he worries about us," Oliver said. Samuel chuckled. "I've always suspected that." The cat gave a tiny flick of its tail, as though pretending not to hear. When they reached the bookshop, Samuel paused before opening the door. Instead of going inside immediately, he looked up at the sign hanging above them. The wooden board swayed almost imperceptibly in the breeze. "You know," he said, "people often ask why I only open after sunset. I was wondering that myself." Samuel rested one hand on the old brass handle. "Most businesses open when everyone is awake." Oliver nodded. "That makes sense." "It does." Samuel smiled. "But I realized many years ago that mornings already have enough places asking people to hurry." He looked down the peaceful lane. "I wanted to create one place that greeted people after the rushing was finished." Oliver looked at the softly glowing windows. "So this place isn't really about books?" "Oh, the books matter." Samuel laughed quietly. "But they're only part of the welcome." The brass bell chimed gently as they stepped inside. The familiar scent greeted them once again. Old paper, cedar wood, chamomile, lavender, a hint of the apple cake they had carried with them. It already felt like coming home. The fire had settled into glowing coals, their warmth filling the room with a quiet comfort that no modern heater quite seemed able to imitate. Samuel knelt beside the hearth. From a small basket, he selected a single piece of oak and laid it carefully onto the embers. For a moment nothing happened. Then tiny flames appeared, slowly stretching upward until the fire began to dance once again. Oliver watched with quiet fascination. "You only added one log." "One is enough." Samuel brushed a little ash aside with the fireplace poker. "Fires don't need very much if they've already been cared for." Oliver wasn't entirely sure why, but the sentence felt like it meant more than firewood. The orange cat reclaimed its favorite cushion by the window with obvious satisfaction. Within moments, it had curled itself into a perfect circle. "I admire that. The sleeping, the confidence." Samuel smiled. "He never wonders if he's earned his rest." Oliver sat quietly. Neither, he realized, did children, or birds, or trees. Only people seemed to convince themselves that rest had to be deserved. The thought stayed with him. Samuel disappeared behind the counter once more. This time he returned carrying something long and narrow wrapped in soft linen. "I almost forgot." "What is it?" "A small tradition." He unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a simple fountain pen. Its body was dark walnut polished smooth by years of careful use. The brass clip had faded to a warm golden color. "It's beautiful." Samuel handed it to Oliver. "It isn't expensive. It doesn't need to be. My father gave it to me." "The clockmaker?" Samuel nodded. "The day I opened the shop." Oliver turned it gently in his hands. It felt perfectly balanced. "I've written thousands of pages with it." Samuel smiled. "Now I mostly use pencils." Oliver looked surprised. "Why?" "They forgive mistakes more easily." Both men laughed. Samuel reached into another drawer and removed a small bottle of deep blue ink. "Go ahead." Oliver uncapped the pen. The nib glided smoothly across a blank sheet of paper Samuel placed on the counter. He wasn't sure what to write. After a moment he simply wrote today's date. Then beneath it, "The quiet found me before I knew I was looking for it." He set the pen down. The ink shimmered for a moment before drying into a rich midnight blue. Samuel looked at the sentence and smiled. "I think the quiet would be happy to hear that." Oliver laughed softly. "I've never considered quiet to have feelings. It certainly has patience." The old pendulum clock near the staircase continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Oliver listened carefully. Earlier in the evening, it had simply been another sound. Now it seemed almost comforting. Not a reminder that time was passing. A reminder that it was perfectly all right to let it pass. The cat twitched one ear in its sleep. Outside, the breeze stirred the ivy climbing the brick walls. Somewhere farther down the lane, a wind chime answered with 3 delicate notes before becoming still once more. Samuel carried the fountain pen back to its linen cloth. Before wrapping it away, he ran his thumb gently across the smooth walnut. "My father always believed good tools should be used." Oliver nodded. "Not locked away." "Exactly." He carefully folded the cloth around it again. "The same goes for beautiful evenings." Oliver looked toward the window. The lanterns still glowed outside. The stars remained scattered across the sky. Nothing about the night seemed in a hurry to end. He realized that somewhere during the past few hours, this little bookshop had stopped feeling like a place he was visiting. Instead, it had begun to feel like somewhere he belonged. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because every shelf, every chair, every quiet conversation had gently reminded him that belonging often begins the moment we stop pretending we have to be somewhere else. The fire crackled softly. The lantern outside cast a warm circle of light across the cobblestones. And within the comforting embrace of cedar, tea, old books, and quiet friendship, the evening continued unfolding exactly as it always had, one peaceful moment at a time. End of Part 15. The fire settled into a slow, steady glow. Its light no longer danced across the walls with lively shadows. Instead, it rested quietly, as though even the flames had decided the evening deserved a gentler ending. Oliver sat near the window, listening. Not for anything in particular. Simply listening. The pendulum clock marked each passing second with calm certainty. The cat slept without the slightest concern for tomorrow. Outside, a breeze wandered through the ivy, carrying the fragrance of lavender from the garden. For a long while, neither Oliver nor Samuel spoke. Eventually, Samuel broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you arrived this evening." He smiled kindly. "What were you carrying?" Oliver thought for a moment. "My briefcase." Samuel shook his head gently. "I wasn't thinking about that." Oliver looked down at his hands. Then he understood. "Worry?" Samuel nodded. "A fair amount of it." "And now?" Oliver searched for the answer. He expected something dramatic, something life-changing. Instead, what came to him was wonderfully simple. "I don't think I left my worries behind." Samuel listened. "I think I just stopped holding them so tightly." A warm smile spread across Samuel's face. "I believe that's wiser." He stood and walked toward the front door. "Come." They stepped outside one final time. The lane was almost completely still. The lanterns glowed patiently beneath the stars. Somewhere in the distance, an owl greeted the approaching dawn with one quiet call. The sky along the eastern horizon had begun to soften ever so slightly. Not bright. Just enough to hint that morning would eventually arrive. Oliver noticed the first faint gray-blue ribbon above the trees. "I've been here all night." "You have. It doesn't feel that long." "The best evenings rarely do." They began walking slowly toward the train station. The orange cat remained on the bookshop's front step, watching them leave. It blinked once, then curled into a comfortable circle, entirely confident that tomorrow evening would arrive exactly when it should. Halfway down the lane they passed Clara's bakery. The windows were still dark. Yet through a tiny opening above the door came the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread beginning its morning journey. "She's already awake." Samuel smiled. "She says bread prefers the early hours." A little farther on, they crossed the quiet square. The fountain continued its gentle song. The maple leaf they had watched earlier had drifted to the edge of the basin, resting peacefully against the stone. Nothing had hurried it there. It had simply arrived. At the station, the platform looked just as it had the evening before. Wooden benches, lavender in the flower boxes, the warm glow of old lanterns. Only now, the birds were beginning their first tentative songs. Oliver placed a hand in his coat pocket. The blue notebook was still there, along with the autumn leaf. Neither seemed remarkable, yet both somehow felt priceless. The first morning train appeared in the distance, its headlights glowing softly beneath the pale sky. As it slowed into the station, Oliver turned toward Samuel. "I'll come back." Samuel smiled, though he didn't seem surprised. "I know. Next week. Perhaps. Or tomorrow." Samuel chuckled. "The bookshop will be here." Oliver hesitated. "There is one thing I've been wondering." "What is it?" "How did you know I'd walk down that little lane?" Samuel looked toward the quiet street that disappeared between the old stone buildings. "I didn't. You seemed so certain." "I was only certain that sooner or later." He looked kindly at Oliver. "Everyone grows tired of rushing." The train doors opened with their familiar sigh. Oliver stepped aboard. He found a window seat and looked back. Samuel raised a hand in farewell. Not a dramatic wave. Just the kind exchanged between old friends who know they'll meet again. The train began to move. Slowly at first. Then steadily. The little station slipped behind. The rooftops followed. For just a moment, Oliver caught one final glimpse of the narrow cobblestone lane. From where he sat, it looked almost ordinary. So ordinary, in fact, that he wondered how many times he had walked past it without noticing. Perhaps hundreds. Perhaps more. As the town disappeared beyond the trees, Oliver opened the little blue notebook. On the next blank page he wrote, "There is a quiet place somewhere in every life. Sometimes it is a garden. Sometimes it is a favorite chair beside a window. Sometimes it is a slow walk after sunset. And sometimes it is simply the moment we remember that we do not have to hurry through the life we are hoping to enjoy." He closed the notebook. Outside the train window, the morning sun rose gently over fields washed with golden light. People would soon wake. Coffee would brew. Newspapers would land on front porches. School buses would begin their familiar routes. Offices would fill. Meetings would start. Emails would arrive. The busy world would continue exactly as it always had. But something inside Oliver had quietly changed. He no longer believed that every empty moment needed to be filled. He no longer measured a good day only by what he accomplished. He had learned that rest was not a reward. Peace was not something waiting at the end of a perfectly organized life. It had always been available in the small, ordinary moments that so often passed unnoticed. The warmth of a cup of tea, the scent of fresh bread, a handwritten note, the sound of leaves in an old maple tree, a quiet conversation, a book opened without hurry, the distant chime of a clock, the company of a sleepy orange cat, the kindness of strangers who slowly became friends, and the simple gift of looking up long enough to notice the stars. Years later, people in the little New England town would sometimes smile when they saw a familiar man step off the evening train. He never arrived carrying the same worries he once had. Instead, he walked with unhurried steps toward the narrow cobblestone lane, where warm lanterns glowed beside an old brick building with ivy climbing its walls. The little brass bell above the door would ring softly. The fire would already be burning. Tea would be waiting. The cat would almost certainly be asleep. And Samuel would look up from whatever book he happened to be shelving, smile as though no time had passed at all, and say the very same words he had spoken on Oliver's first visit. "I'm very glad you found your way here." Because some places never ask us to become someone else. They simply remind us of the peaceful person we were all along. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the noise of everyday life, there is still a quiet lane waiting beneath the evening sky. A warm light glowing in an old window. A comfortable chair beside a gentle fire. A story patiently resting on a shelf. Waiting for someone who isn't in a hurry. If you ever happen to find such a place, may you linger there a little while. May you breathe a little more deeply. May you look up at the stars. And when morning comes, may you carry a small piece of that quiet back into the world with you. Sleep well. The end.